Imagine being handed a kingdom and knowing the moment it touches your hands that it's already slipping through your fingers. Imagine walking through a palace where every servant bows, every soldier salutes, every door opens for you, and knowing that in 34 days they'll all stop. This is the story of a king who didn't lose his crown in battle. He didn't lose it to a revolution. He lost it to a ballot. His name was Umberto, and he was the last man to sit on the throne of Italy. To understand how Umberto lost everything, you have to understand what he inherited long before he inherited a crown. He was born on September 15th, 1904, in the castle of Racconigi, a sprawling royal estate in Piedmont, surrounded by vineyards and mountains that had belonged to his family for nearly 1,000 years. The House of Savoy wasn't just a royal family, it was the royal family of Italy. They had unified the country in 1861, stitching together a patchwork of rival kingdoms and city-states into a single nation under their rule. So, when Umberto was born, the only son, the only male heir, the weight on his shoulders was enormous before he could even walk. But here's what nobody tells you about growing up in the House of Savoy. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't warm. It was cold. His father, King Victor Emmanuel III, ran the royal household like a barracks, and the rules he imposed on his own son would scar Umberto for life. Victor Emmanuel III was not a man you'd picture as a king. He was barely 5 feet tall. He spoke softly. He avoided confrontation. And yet within the walls of his own palace, he was absolute. Every time Umberto entered his father's presence, every single time, even as a grown man, even as a decorated military officer, he was required to drop to one knee, take his father's hand, and kiss it. Only then could he speak. Think about that for a second. A grown man, a crown prince, a future king, on his knees, kissing his father's hand before being allowed to say a single word. Historians who studied the Savoy family describe Victor Emmanuel as emotionally distant, authoritarian, and deeply controlling. Umberto's education was almost entirely military: strategy, drills, horsemanship, obedience. Politics, that was deliberately kept out. The Savoy tradition was that heirs learned politics only after they took the throne, not before. So here you have a young man, intelligent, observant, trapped inside a system that demanded total submission, and he's being prepared to rule a country he's not allowed to understand. But outside the palace walls, Italy was changing, and a new force was rising that would poison everything the Savoy family had built. In October 1922, when Umberto was just 18 years old, Benito Mussolini marched on Rome. His father, the king, had a choice. He could have used the army to crush Mussolini's blackshirts. The military was ready. The troops were positioned. All they needed was the order. It never came. Victor Emmanuel refused to declare martial law. He appointed Mussolini as prime minister instead. Years later, Umberto himself would tell an Italian newspaper that his father had viewed the decision as a justifiable risk. It was the most catastrophic miscalculation in the history of the Italian monarchy. Over the next 2 decades, Mussolini dismantled Italy's democracy, built a fascist police state, dragged the country into wars of conquest in Ethiopia and Albania, and ultimately aligned Italy with Nazi Germany and plunged it into the Second World War. And through all of it, through every brutal law, every military adventure, every shattered treaty, the crown sat silently on Victor Emmanuel's head. He didn't stop it. He didn't resist it. In many cases, he signed off on it. Umberto, he was caught in the middle. He was a military man. He commanded troops. In June 1940, When Italy entered the war alongside Hitler, Umberto was put in charge of Army Group West during the invasion of France. It was a disaster. The Italian army barely advanced a few kilometers, and Umberto's reputation as a general was saved only because France had already been defeated by Germany and signed an armistice. But privately, Umberto was turning against the war. After the catastrophic Italian defeats at Stalingrad and El Alamein in 1942 and 1943, he began to see what his father could not, that Italy was on the wrong side of history and that the monarchy was going down with the ship. In July 1943, the Allies invaded Sicily. Mussolini was arrested, and the Italian monarchy had one last chance to save itself. What happened next would seal its fate forever. When Mussolini fell in July 1943, it should have been the moment the king redeemed himself. The dictator was gone. The fascists were crumbling. The Allies were at the gates. But Victor Emmanuel did something that Italians would never forgive. He ran. On September 8, 1943, Italy announced an armistice with the Allies. And instead of staying in Rome, instead of standing with his people, instead of leading, Victor Emmanuel fled south to Brindisi, abandoning the capital. The German army poured into Rome within hours. Thousands of Italian soldiers were disarmed and shipped off to labor camps. The city was occupied. The people were abandoned. The image of the king fleeing his own capital while his country burned. That image seared itself into the Italian consciousness like a brand. And Umberto? He was with his father. He watched it happen. He was complicit by proximity, tainted by association, guilty by blood. By 1944, it was clear that Victor Emmanuel had become radioactive. The Allies didn't trust him. The Italian people despised him. Even his own supporters were whispering that he needed to go. So in June 1944, the king made a desperate move. He transferred most of his powers to Umberto, naming him Lieutenant General of the realm. Victor Emmanuel kept the title of king, but his son would do the actual ruling. It was a gamble. The hope was that Umberto, younger, cleaner, untainted by the worst decisions, could salvage the monarchy's reputation before the inevitable referendum. But here's what Victor Emmanuel didn't count on. The Italian people didn't just want a different king. They were starting to wonder whether they wanted a king at all. On May 9, 1946, Victor Emmanuel III finally did the one thing he had resisted for years. He abdicated. He packed his bags, boarded a ship, and left Italy for Egypt, where he would die in exile less than a year later, a broken man in a foreign land. And just like that, Umberto was king. King Umberto II of Italy. He had waited his entire life for this moment. 41 years old, a military man, a father of 4. And now, finally, the crown was his. But the timing was a nightmare. In 1 month, June 2nd, 1946, the Italian people would vote in a national referendum. The question on the ballot was simple, and it was devastating. Monarchy or republic? Umberto had 34 days to convince a wounded, war-ravaged country that the institution his family had led for 85 years, the institution that had handed power to Mussolini, fled from Rome, and presided over national humiliation, was worth saving. 34 days. That's why they called him the May King. Re di Maggio. Because by June, he might not be king at all. Umberto threw himself into the campaign. He traveled the country. He shook hands. He kissed babies. He visited hospitals and factories and bombed out neighborhoods. But there was a problem he couldn't solve with charm or speeches, a problem that lived inside his own marriage, Behind the gilded doors of the Quirinal Palace, Umberto's personal life was its own kind of tragedy. He had married Princess Marie-José of Belgium in 1930, a union arranged, as royal marriages often were, for political alliance rather than love. She was the daughter of King Albert I of the Belgians, intelligent, sophisticated, deeply cultured. By all accounts, the marriage was unhappy from the start. Marie-José was a woman of the left, progressive, intellectual, sympathetic to socialist ideas. Umberto was a military conservative, a product of the rigid Savoy system. They were oil and water. She was bored by court life. He was emotionally stunted by a childhood spent kissing his father's hand on his knees. During the war years, they lived largely separate lives. Marie-José spent time in Switzerland. Umberto remained in Italy. There were rumors, affairs on both sides. The palace whispered, the press hinted, and the Italian public, already skeptical of the monarchy, began to see the royal family not as a symbol of national unity, but as a soap opera. In the spring of 1946, as Umberto campaigned for the survival of his throne, Marie-José was thousands of miles away. She would return briefly, stand beside him for public appearances, but the damage was done. How do you sell the magic of monarchy when your own queen won't even stay in the same country? While Umberto fought for his throne on the campaign trail, a far bigger battle was being fought in the shadows. One that would make the referendum's outcome far less certain than anyone expected. June 2nd, 1946, the day Italy decided. For the first time in the country's history, women were allowed to vote. 28 million Italians, men and women, rich and poor, north and south, went to the polls and answered one question. Should Italy remain a monarchy under the House of Savoy, or should it become a republic? The atmosphere was electric. The country was deeply divided. The South, rural, traditional, more loyal to the crown, leaned toward the monarchy. The North, industrialized, politically radicalized, the heart of the anti-fascist resistance, leaned heavily toward the republic. Umberto waited. He had done everything he could. He had campaigned. He had pleaded. He had presented himself as a new kind of king, modern, approachable, untainted by fascism. Whether it would be enough, he didn't know. The results came in slowly, province by province, city by city, and the numbers told a story. The Republic was winning, not by a landslide, but by enough. When the Supreme Court of Cassation announced the final results on June 10th, the numbers were devastating. 12.7 million votes for the Republic, 10.7 million votes for the monarchy, 54% to 46%. Italy had voted to abolish its own king. Umberto had one thing left to decide. Would he fight it? Would he refuse to go? Would he cling to a crown that his country no longer wanted? What he did next would define him forever. Umberto II left Italy on June 13, 1946. He didn't wait for the final legal ruling. The monarchist party had filed appeals, claiming fraud, claiming irregularities, claiming that the vote in the South had been suppressed. The Supreme Court would reject every single one of them 5 days later. But Umberto didn't wait. He chose to go. Some called it cowardice. Others called it dignity. He boarded a plane at Ciampino Airport in Rome, bound for Cascais, a small coastal town in Portugal. He took almost nothing with him. No crown, no throne, no kingdom, just a suitcase and a title that no longer meant anything. The Italian government passed a constitutional amendment banning Umberto and all male descendants of the House of Savoy from ever setting foot on Italian soil again. The ban would last for more than half a century. Umberto would never return. He settled in Cascais, in a modest villa overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. He lived simply, far more simply than a king should. He read, he walked, he corresponded with supporters. He never abdicated his claim to the throne, not even in exile. To the end, he insisted he was still the king of Italy. But Italy had moved on. His marriage finally collapsed. Marie-José left for Mexico, then Switzerland. His children scattered across Europe. The family that had once ruled a nation was now a family fractured, scattered, forgotten. Umberto II died on March 18, 1983, in a hospital in Geneva, Switzerland. He was 78 years old. He had lived in exile for 37 years. 37 years without setting foot in the country his family had ruled for nearly a century. 37 years, watching from afar as Italy rebuilt itself, reinvented itself, became one of the world's largest economies, all without a king. He was buried at Hautecombe Abbey in the French Alps, the traditional burial site of the House of Savoy. Not in Italy, never in Italy. Even in death, the ban held. His tomb faces east, toward Italy, toward the country that had been his, and then wasn't. History is full of kings who were overthrown, kings who were executed, kings who were assassinated, exiled, erased. But Umberto II's story is different. He wasn't destroyed by a conqueror. He wasn't killed by a revolution. He was voted out. The Italian people looked at 1,000 years of Savoy history. The wars, the unifications, the triumphs, the betrayals. And they said quietly, at the ballot box, no more. And Umberto, he could have fought, he could have refused, he could have clung to power and turned the referendum into a crisis. Instead, he walked away. He boarded a plane. He flew to a small town in Portugal. And he watched the sun set over the Atlantic, knowing he would never see Rome again. Some kings are remembered for the battles they won. Umberto II is remembered for the one he didn't fight. He was the last king of Italy, and for 34 days in May, he was king of everything. By June, he was king of nothing. Subscribe to Past Unlocked History for more stories from the shadows of the past.